You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Okay, hi everyone. We're back. Welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, Star Trek The Next Generation podcast, hosted by myself, Jay Reckward, and my dad, Jake Reckward. We're recording this for the benefit of my son, Ben the Bear, but we know there's so many great Star Trek fans out there that we're putting all the shows out for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay, and you?
I'm doing really well. I'm looking forward to tonight's episode. There's a common belief among the fans that for Star Trek The Next Generation, the show really gets good around Season 3. But I think Season 2, which we've been reviewing so far for this chunk of episodes, I think this is one of the first episodes that really kind of hits the potential of what Star Trek is as a show in terms of discussing really deep, complicated, humanistic, but also philosophical things.
Yes.
Yeah. I think Measure of the Man is... Oh, sorry, folks. We'll get into that. We're reviewing The Measure of Man's Season 2, Episode 9, which debuted on, I believe it was February 13th, 1989.
Mm-hmm.
And to set up the episode, the Enterprise D is visiting the newly built Starbase 173 for a crew rotation. During the visit, Captain Picard actually runs into... it seems to be... It's a JAG officer by the name of Captain
Phillipa Louvois.
Louvois, thank you.
Yes.
For some reason I thought it was Louvois, but it's Louvois. Phillipa
Right.
Louvois, who he's not seen in 10 years. Apparently, Phillipa was a longtime friend who prosecuted Captain Picard during the court-martial following the loss of the Stargazer, which we reviewed last season for, I believe the episode's called The Battle, which covers the Battle of Maxia. So, while this meeting's happening, Admiral Nakamura, accompanied by a commander named Bruce Maddox, who's a Starfleet cyberneticist, arrives on the Enterprise and basically informs Picard that Lieutenant Commander Data has been requisitioned by Commander Maddox for basically experimentation. He wants to deconstruct Data with the idea of being able to finally look at a positronic brain and potentially develop more datas. Essentially, what we're talking about here is Maddox's ability to replicate Noonien Soon's work as it comes to the kind of Soonian android that we see in this series and also later on Picard, when I forget what the planet's called, but they actually have a planet of Soon type androids.
Right.
So, I think that we actually saw Starbase 173 before when they are doing this crew rotation. I think it's the first time, though, they've established that Starbase 173 is near the Romulan neutral zone.
Well, the last Starbase, remember we talked about this, how many Starbases are there, was 179.
Right.
So this is 173. So it gives you the idea that there might be, close to 200 different Starbases through the Federation sector of the galaxy. But you're right. One thing that was interesting, that it was specifically established close to the neutral zone, probably so they could watch the Romulans.
Honestly, I've noticed one thing throughout the show, and they kind of started building it, or at least they built it last season, and they will build it in this season with the episode where they debut the Borg. But a lot of the episodes that the Enterprise D, I'm sorry, a lot of the episodes where the Enterprise D is involved. Can you hear that on the?
Yeah, you can hear it.
Here,
So,
sorry, folks. Give me 1 second. Let me shut the window. There's a.
ambulance going by, sounds like.
Hopefully that's better.
Yeah, it's fine.
Sorry, that siren interrupted my thinking. Um, so they established in this last season, and then this season when they debut the Borg, that a lot of the missions that the Enterprise D takes part in actually take place around the Romulan neutral zone. It seems like a pretty stable setting, or at least a portion of space that a lot of these stories are going to be taking part in into the future.
Yes, yes.
And I wonder if that means at this point the Enterprise is still on a mission of exploration, or if things are escalating with the Romulans at this point to where Starfleet expects the flagship to be there.
I think their mission, as we've discussed, is really a mixed bag. I mean,
Right.
they're used in a very flexible manner.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we will see in a later episode the Enterprise's sister ship. I think it's called the not the Yorktown,
The Yamato.
the Yamato. That's right. Which will unfortunately be destroyed. But you would think that with Galaxy class starships and them being in production, that they would try to avoid this issue of having their top of the line vessel always having to be stuck at the Romulan neutral zone in case a war jumps off versus out there exploring. Um, it just seems to me like there's not a lot of coordination on the end of Starfleet when it comes to actually protecting themselves from the Romulans. It always seems very like touch and go.
It'd be hard to tell because you kind of have to know what their order of battle is, to use that term, is to
Right.
how many ships and of what types they have and how they're actually deployed. And, we don't have a sense of what the three-dimensional geography is of, you know, how much space they need to cover and so on.
There are multiple maps that Star Trek has produced to show what the actual territory of like the Alpha
Okay.
Quadrant versus the
Right.
Beta Quadrant versus the
Right.
Delta Quadrant looks like.
Right.
I think there's an updated one that actually shows like Voyager's journey through the Delta Quadrant
Ah,
during
interesting.
its 7 year run. Um,
Now, of course, a question about that. That's a, fictitious star map,
yeah, of course.
but the map is based on the actual geography of the galaxy, correct?
I believe the Alpha Quadrant is as close to us as it possibly can be.
Right.
I think when they started filling in the Beta and Delta quadrants, um, they took a lot of license. And of course, the Gamma Quadrant is basically made up from what I understand. Like, writers just come in and make up new things for it every
Right.
time.
Right. Yeah.
Um, One thing I'm just wondering, since we're kind of stuck on this question about the setting, them always being near the Romulan neutral zone, is there maybe there's a portion of the Romulan neutral zone that is unexplored? Because one thing that we think of when it comes to like the idea of there being a partition between territories, like let's take the demilitarized zone or DMZ between like North Korea and South Korea. There's a definite boundary where it starts at one end in the east and it ends at the other end in the west that separates north from south. But that's a very kind of spatial defined boundary. How do you actually define a neutral zone in space? Like, what would the actual bounds be? Like, is the Enterprise able to go to like the far bound of the quote unquote northern end of the neutral zone where it ends and explore over there? Um, I think there's just a lot of interesting questions when it comes to that.
Sure. Yes. Right.
But transitioning a little bit back to the story itself, we actually, before everything kicks off with Maddox, we actually have a really good poker scene with the crew of the Enterprise, which include four of the senior staff and Chief Miles O'Brien. I believe it's Dr. Pulaski, Lieutenant LaForge,
Riker.
Riker, Data, and yeah, just Chief O'Brien. I don't think Worf's
Yeah.
there, right?
Um, I think Worf was there. Yes, Worf was there too.
Right. Because they're talking about bluffing.
Yes.
I think it's a really interesting scene. Um, just because, on one hand, it really establishes that a lot of these friendships have been forming behind the scenes when we don't see it, when, the quote unquote, when the cameras aren't running and, we aren't watching the crew of the Enterprise on a constant basis.
Hmm.
I think that there's a really interesting kind of interplay between Riker and Data that kind of gets reinforced throughout the show, where Data looks at Riker for a lot of examples on how to act and how to perceive and how to behave, even going to the point where it's, um, at the very end of the episode when everything's resolved, Riker says, and I think I have the actual line here. Oh yeah, after Riker has failed to prosecute Data, um, he says, Riker says, "You're a wise man, my friend," and Data responds, "Not yet, sir, but with your help, I'm learning." I actually think that is a good the very end of the episode is a good capstone
Yes.
for this scene right here,
Yes.
because Data really does look at Riker in many ways in terms of how to, I guess, act like an officer. It's funny because we never really define like how Data really acts with it, interacts with everyone, because on many ways, Jean-Luc Picard is Data's dad. Geordi is Data's best friend. I've always, and I wonder what you think of this. I've always kind of seen Data and Riker as a little bit of not brotherly, but more of a mentor.
Exactly. You took the word out of my mouth. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Like I
Uh-huh.
think there's a little bit more of a mentorship going on between those two
Yes.
characters.
Yes. I think so.
Um, do you have actually, since we're on the topic of character interactions, character relationships, and maybe not even just Next Generation, but any of the shows, is there a relationship between two characters that in Star Trek that you enjoy more than the others?
I
I've been wanting
think.
to ask you this question because I've been trying to
Well,
think hard about it too.
I think that the in the original series there was a um, close relationship between Kirk and Spock, and then there was a separate close relationship that built up over time between McCoy and Spock,
Right.
and then they actually were a triumvirate, the
Mm-hmm.
three of them, because Kirk and McCoy would make jokes about Spock and so forth, and the differences and so on. So I think that inter character relationships between those three in the original series was very good.
Right. I've always thought that I think you're right. There was always a triumvirate between Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, but watching the kind of adversarial relationship between Spock and McCoy kind of coalesce into this kind of teasing friendship where they really do like each other a lot. They just say awful things to each other. I've always really respected that characterization because I think that's a realistic relationship between two people
And
in
and
that
the other
situation.
and the other ones, I can't talk for DS9 and Voyager and so forth, but I think that in Enterprise there was a really good relationship, um, although it was tested at times between Archer and Trip, and
Right.
of course, there was a relationship between Trip and T'Pol, and there was a very close relationship between T'Pol and Archer. So some of the dinner scenes they had in the captain's cabin, where it was the three of them, there
Right.
was a
Those were
little bit
great scenes.
there was a little bit of a triumvirate there also.
Right.
Um,
I was going to say Archer and Trip as well. I always thought that, especially Scott Bakula, and I forget the other, Connor
Con-
Trenier. That
Connor Trenier, yeah, that was his
I
name. The
I
actor's
always
name.
thought that those two had really great chemistry and were able to pull off the fact that they were not only officers who had really come up together through the Warp 5 program, but they were also like deeply, they really were best friends that relied on each other.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
you know what, I have to say, getting back to TNG, I actually like um, Worf and Deanna Troy a lot.
Yes,
I
right.
actually think that those two worked very well together, as well as I think
Oh, there's the Beverly Crusher Picard
you're
relationship.
right. I was about to say those two are great as well. I think there's like a lot of characters that kind of fall into natural chemistry. Like
Yeah.
LeVar Burton and Brett Spiner really do work well
Yes.
together as Geordi and Data. Where I feel like Michael Dorn and Jonathan Frakes have always worked really well together as Riker and Worf.
Yes.
Um, but kind of moving on from this. One thing that I did want to cover. One thing that starts to happen in season 2 is that we see Chief O'Brien a lot more, and it's
Yes.
very interesting his inclusion because for the most part, everyone on the bridge except Wesley Crusher is an officer. It's always established that O'Brien is an enlisted man, and they really establish that in DS9 that he's enlisted. I kind of find it interesting that they are starting to kind of walk this line between the officer and the enlisted men on the ship because they've never really made a huge distinction between the two. Um, and I was just wondering what your thoughts were on Chief O'Brien, his appearance.
I think he's kind of unique because I was watching him. I think it's in the card game that he had like one of the little officer pips on his
Mm-hmm.
collar. I'm thinking, well, if he's a chief, what's the insignia for like a chief petty officer in the
Right.
Navy? Because the Enterprise being a ship, it's more akin. Their rank is more akin to naval ranks as opposed to Army and Marine Corps and so forth. And I was thinking, okay, is the color different so that indicates that he's a senior non commissioned officer? I mean,
Right.
it's almost he becomes so valuable in the things he knows, the engineering. It's almost kind of like on submarines. What I've learned, whether it's Russian, Soviet, or American, they'll have a chief of the boat
Mm-hmm.
who's the chief, the most senior enlisted man who really is the kind of the father of the crew and so forth.
Right. Well, as it comes to the pips, I know that in DS9 they give the enlisted officers their own version, their own pips. Like it's not the standard brass um, dot that we usually
Right,
see, which is
right.
sometimes filled in with a with a black filling to indicate, I think, the lieutenant commander or someone in the transition period between two larger postings. But I always liked the Miles O'Brien character. I think that later on, when they finally started establishing his participation in like the Starfleet, the Federation Cardassian Wars, I think he becomes a very interesting character in the fact that we focus a lot on officers in general in Star Trek, but it's often the enlisted men who are often left to do the harder jobs and who are often subjected to really the travails and dangers of the real adventures.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've been reading a lot of Tolkien recently. I recently finished his biography, and one thing that Tolkien went through was, he was a veteran of the Battle of the Somme, and he saw a lot of the veteran and enlisted relationships. And you know, traditionally in fiction, it seems like they try to portray the veteran, I mean, the officer and enlisted relationship as something that's always contentious and, relatively classist. Like, the officers are always kind of coming from well to do backgrounds, while the enlisted, of course, are from the lower and middle classes of society. I like that in Star Trek there is this clear kind of mixing of the two, to the point where, like, even even Riker is willing to invite an enlisted man to come play poker because there's really no difference.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I just wonder, like, do they have, like, could O'Brien become a captain himself as an enlisted man, or be given command of his own ship?
No,
Or
no,
okay, I wouldn't
no,
think so,
no.
because at one point, he is given, like, at one point he becomes the chief engineer, even though he's enlisted at DS9. Like, he runs the entire station, and then later on he's invited to serve as a professor of engineering at Starfleet Academy. But and you can correct me on this one, Dad, if I'm wrong, because I don't have enough base knowledge of the inner workings of the Navy. But so correct me, if you're not an officer, you can't become like a captain or be in charge of a ship. If you're enlisted, you can only go so far in the rankings, correct?
Correct. I mean,
It, it
it's conceivable that, like in the Coast Guard, some of the rescue boats, or
right.
maybe some of the really smaller craft, you could have a chief petty officer as almost like a bosun who could be in charge of a small craft. But
Gotcha.
any ship of any size, it's going to have an officer in command.
So, why do you think that they are continuing that differentiation in the 24th century? Because if everyone's going to, do you think that the enlisted officers don't have as much training as the officers do, or
I would think that there's that if you have an enlisted person, like if somebody is a scientist, they will have specific training. They'll be a member of Starfleet, but they may not have gone to the academy. Because
right?
if you use the Starfleet Academy in the same way that we use service academies here, and the same thing in Russia and England and other countries with their militaries, it's the academy is where you groom your officers, your officer corps.
Do you find that to be classist?
Um,
Because it seems like it often falls to that, where,
I
like, there
think
is a lot of classism built into it
I think it
traditionally.
I think it used to be classist. I don't think it's that is as classist as it was
Hmm.
now.
Well, that makes sense, because it seemed, well, I think that we should differentiate between, like, uh, the American military and what a lot of traditional European militaries were, which were formed under monarchies, and a lot of their officer corps was made up of, like, aristocrats. Where here in America, a lot of our officer corps is usually made up of people who go and get their education first and then go and join the service.
Well, I mean, if you took the Corps, you have people that I don't know what percentage of officers in the U.S. military are service academy graduates, but they certainly have. They might have a little bit more, polish. They might have a little bit more political oomph in terms of
Mm.
promotions and that sort of thing. But starting with Truman desegregating the military in 1947, and then the military thus being an engine of social change because it put blacks and whites and Hispanics and Asians together, working together on a team. And so that the military has been very good for social change in that direction, even though there are,
Still
you
is,
know,
though, in many ways.
it still is, even though there's problems with racism in the military within the ranks and so forth. But then, once you had, women in the
Hmm.
service academies, and you have women commanding ships at some points.
Right.
Matter of fact, I saw something on YouTube. The first Japanese female officer is a commander of a Japanese destroyer.
Hmm. Well, we're on the cusp, I think. Well, it's a can of worms to get into, but I think we're on the cusp of sending women in the battle and actually leading in
Well,
battle for the first time if
well
we come
yeah.
to such an event where we have to go to war with someone again.
Well, the fact that you've got female Army helicopter pilots and a lot of
Right.
Navy and Air Force fighter pilots now, it's there. We're basically there.
Oh, one of my friends in the publishing world is, I think she's a colonel, Janine Spinlove. She's a C-130 pilot for the
Yeah,
Marines,
sure,
or she was.
right,
I
sure,
think she's in Washington now, serving for some general. But she was a very lauded and well-regarded C-130 pilot.
absolutely, yeah.
So let's transition to like the real bulk of the story here, because what we get to is Captain Maddox shows up and he basically says, I'm here to basically requisition data so I can disassemble him and understand Soong's engineering of these androids on the idea that I'm going to create more. And we should basically cover basically what I'm sorry, I'm saying basically a lot. We should cover what the general argument Maddox is making here. Um, Maddox believes that Data is not sentient, but Data is a tool, and that if he is able to disassemble Data and learn how a positronic brain works, and basically his theory is that once he's able to do it, he will be able to replicate multiple Datas.
He
That
wants to he wants to reverse engineer. Yeah,
right, with the goal being that, and they say it multiple times through Data's trial, that if you had officers, like if you had android officers on every Federation starship, you could have them performing tasks that would get typical human officers, about let's call them biologics, um, typical non-android officers into real trouble. Like they would be able to deal with radiation and combat situations. They would be able to deal with the vacuum of space. There's so many applications that an android would far exceed us in terms of performance. That Maddox's argument is that we need this because it will help us progress.
well, and on a practical basis, we've talked about this before. Is that Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, that they're basically robots
Right.
that we've sent out as explorers, and then if you had a true android like Data, that had, well, sentience and could make decisions on what kind of data to collect as they went out into interstellar space and found new things to study, that they wouldn't have the biological issues of they would be possibly immune to radiation that biologics would encounter. uh, they wouldn't have an aging issue.
Oh yeah.
There wouldn't be the issue of waste per se, and food to be carried and all of that sort of thing. So you and I have talked about that if you had a really smart robot slash android, that might be the best way for our species to actually explore interstellar space.
Well, even from not even from an exploration standpoint, but we were talking a few minutes ago about the military. From a militaristic standpoint, instead of having like flesh and blood soldiers who get tired and need to be, and like you mentioned, need to be fed and clothed and sheltered in between battles, you could foreseeably put together an android crew, put them on a ship like the Defiant from DS9, and literally send them out there to fight
Well,
until
yeah.
everyone's done.
And there's actually discussion, kind of a debate perhaps in the Air Force, and whether you really would need humans piloting fighter aircraft and so forth, since we're doing drones from the ground and so forth. And I think that the Navy's even talked about robot ships now.
Well, the advent of AI is truly going to change our perception of warfare. And in many ways, and this is kind of a philosophical aside, I think the beginning of warfare for us, in terms of hunter gatherer tribes meeting and having some sort of conflict that had to end up in violence, probably started with sticks and rocks. Sticks and rocks are a very personal thing. Like, for me to kill you with a stick or kill you with a rock, I have to pick up that rock, and I literally have to get close enough to you that I can bash you in the head with it. As violent as that sounds, that's a deeply personal thing to do. Like, death and violence take on a very different connotation, I think, when you actually have to put your hands on someone. And I think that changed when we really had the advent of gunpowder and we're able to make smaller, more mobile, modular arms that a standard person could carry, like a rifle or a musket. You know, I think the transformation that happened when you could start killing someone from a distance where you didn't have to use something like a sword or a club, I think that really started causing a dehumanization in warfare itself because it was no longer this upfront blood and guts affair. It could be far away. Now, let me finish. I see the face that you're making. Now, but the thing is, even with a gun, if I point a gun at you and fire, I still have to watch you die. I still have to see that
Yes.
bullet enter your body, and I still have to see the damage from it.
And what I was going to say is that's what happens with drone pilots that
Right.
are finding a bad guy on the ground in Afghanistan or ISIS, and they're taking them out. They still have the sense that, damn, I just killed somebody, and some people have some issues with that.
Right. And the advent of AI could completely change that, where war stops being a human endeavor.
I
But on
see your
one hand, while that might be good because you may not have pilots who are suffering PTSD because they have to command the drone, will the military AI that we have in the future have the morality or the sense of ethics not to bomb a hospital versus, a building that they know the terrorists are in? Will the drone be able to determine what's collateral damage versus what is required to be destroyed? You know,
talking about they're making. Will they be able to make a moral or ethical decision?
well, when you remove the humanity from something as terrible, but sometimes, and this is a conversation for another episode, folks. If we ever get to one of these episodes, well, I think we will, especially with the Borg. But when it comes to the question of total war,
Hmm.
don't you want to have some sort of human sense of ethic or morality in play to stop the worst from happening? Because if you had an AI that had to calculate the quickest and most efficient way to win a battle, what if they calculated the quickest and efficient way to be the most brutal and didn't even think about executing it?
No, I mean, in terms of rules, I think that was perhaps part of the discussion that Biden and Putin had in Geneva last week. That when Biden says, look, there are certain red lines that should not be touched in terms of infrastructure. And I think, you know what they are. It's, food supply, energy supply, government, elections, if you're a democracy, things like that, healthcare, that if you, cyber attack those sectors, it's going to cause, either, I mean, people could lose their lives and so
Oh
forth. I
yeah,
mean, if you shut down any electrical grid, and I think what Biden was saying is, we need to think about this because if a state sponsored group does something like that, we're not going to sit back and not retaliate. So he was maybe saying, you know, in diplomatic terms, Vladimir, you need to back off and not go further because there will be retaliation.
I think the scary thing about that. So here's the thing. Um, since we're talking about this, and it is kind of applicable to the episode because we are talking about what would happen if cybernetics and AI actually made it out into the real world, which is what Bruce Maddox wants to do. Um, I think Biden had a very mixed performance in Geneva. I think on one hand, he said the right things to Putin, but I think on the other hand, like the media got him on a bunch of good questions. There was one outburst where one reporter, I think I forget what her name was, but she became Twitter famous for a little bit because she got yelled at by the president.
I know which one. Yeah.
So you know the question.
Yeah.
She basically says, "What expectation do you have of Putin to change?" And I think that's a very good question to ask, especially the president, because I think you're right. I think Biden is probably saying, Vladimir, stop and think about this for a second. We have to think about the actual human cost. But I think, what if you run into an actual robot like Vladimir Putin, who's like, whatever. I just want to keep power.
Hmm.
Um, I think that if you have someone who has that attitude of Vladimir Putin, like, whatever, I want to keep power, and then you give him something like an AI for military use, the amount of terror that could be struck would be just so far beyond conception. I even think that they tried to take a stab at that in Picard when the androids turn on the Federation at United Planitia on Mars
Yes.
early
Right.
on.
Right.
I think that that was an example of what would happen if we lost control of our AI.
Hmm. Hmm.
I The thing is, and getting back into the episode and kind of dovetailing away from Biden, even though I think this kind of counts, you know, one thing that is very is made very clear here in Star Trek is that Data is human. And we've discussed this multiple times in episodes previous that dealt with our favorite android, but Data, for all sensible purposes, with the exception of his body, his soul, his mind, and his heart, quote unquote, are human. And it's very clear from the beginning, I think, of the episode. And I watched this episode about 4 times before we recorded this, and we also have a clip from a YouTube show called The Legal Eagle, which discusses the measure of a man from the perspective of a trial lawyer. We'll include a link below to that in the description on YouTube. But you know, one thing that I think the show does well and does poorly at the same time is that we as the audience have already accepted that Data is human. I think the wonderful thing is that since we already know he's human, we know that going in, he's not going to be disassembled.
Right.
But on the other hand, it also provides space for Maddox to come across as such a horrific villain, and in many ways, I think an example of what. And I want to know what you think about this in terms of this episode coming out in I believe it was '89. Um, there's a lot of. I just want to say this out loud before we continue because it's going to be my biggest indictment of Bruce Maddox. But Bruce Maddox reminds me a lot of Joseph Mengele.
Um,
Just in terms of, like, there's a justification for anything.
well, that was one
My
of the
work
things.
takes precedent because of its value over even things like morals and ethics.
Well, I mean, just some of the things that I noted um, when, as you said, Maddox has the opinion that Data is not a sentient being. He refers to Data as this. You
Which is
know,
interesting in terms
and,
of the
and yeah,
gender pronouns
and he
as we've
brings that
discussed them today.
right, and then there's sort of a paradox there because Maddox goes to um, Data's cabin and tries to get him to agree to the disassembly when he doesn't construe him as a being that has free will. But when he goes and talks to Data about that, he is talking to him as if Data has free will. So there's a little of a paradox there. And then he
I
goes on to say at one point that your memories and knowledge will remain intact. And it goes back to a previous episode about the schizoid man.
Yeah,
How does that square with what happened with Dr. Graves downloading his knowledge into the Enterprise's computer.
So let's deal with that because you ask a lot of really great questions that are really important.
And one other thing that happened is that what Data learned during the poker game about bluffing, um, that actually came back. That was part of the conversation. What Data learned about that came back in the conversation with Maddox when he was in his quarters. I can't
Right.
remember the specific lines, but I thought that was good. Where what Data had learned during the poker game scene actually ended up being used later in the story.
Actually, I have I actually have the line here because what happens is Maddox walks into Data's quarters and he picks up one of Data's books that Data's packing away.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And he says, when in disgrace with fortune in men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state. Tell me, are these just words to you, or do you fathom the meaning? And Data bluffs here because he goes, is it not customary to request permission to enter an individual's quarters? Because Data has learned from Riker, as you've noted, don't give anything away.
Hmm.
Actually, there's also another scene that I want to go back to that really doesn't get covered. Um, so right after Data has been told to report to Commander Maddox for disassembly, he meets with Picard to discuss his resignation, and Picard admits that he has to serve Starfleet's interests, and he brings up a very interesting point. In his ready room, here, I'm actually going to read this from
Sure.
Memory
Go ahead.
Alpha. In his ready room, recognizing Starfleet's inherent interest in the creation of more Soong-type androids, Picard, tends to, Picard attempts to persuade Data into submitting to Maddox's procedure. I think that we should remember that Picard does try to convince Data, and we will touch on that in a second. Despite Picard's approach being the opposite of Maddox, with the application that Data is serving a greater good, Data counters that uh, asking him to submit to an uncertain, dangerous, and potentially destructive Starfleet experiment is compul- tantamount to a violation of his rights when he makes the example of Geordi's visor.
Oh, this is very key. Yes,
So
because
he asks
right.
Picard, he says, Geordi has this visor that makes his vision better than anyone else's on the crew. If it is so important for us to optimize Starfleet's best potential in terms of exploring the galaxy and protecting our territory, why aren't all officers required to have their natural eyes removed and replaced with um, a visor?
No, and that's really key because I think Picard has not thought through it because, as you said, he tries to convince Data that he should submit, that he should, follow what Starfleet wants to do. But then once Data uses that example of, Geordie's replacing everyone with, bionic eyes or a visor and so forth, it just stops Picard in his tracks. And
Well,
then and then he starts to shift like I'm really not comfortable with this.
well, I have to ask you a philosophical question. I need to ask you all, not only from the perspective of Jake Record in 2021, but also Jake Record in 1989. Um, it seems to me that the system that we are in, a capitalistic economy, breeds a need for people to dehumanize their workers or their associates in terms of completing certain objectives within their workspace. Picard, in many ways, is doing this because he's putting the interests of Starfleet first. That is his job. Um, do you think that we as a society are bred to put performance above people? And if so, why do you think that is, and what do you think can be done about it?
Oh, I think it
Because you've
is.
served in a lot of different roles. You've served as a manager, you've served as a CEO, you've served as an executive. I think that you would actually have some insight into this.
I think that. going back to like feudalism and serfs and so forth, that workers um, have always been looked to a certain degree as chattel.
Mm-hmm.
Slavery was the worst example of that. I think what's happening now, one of the things that really kind of upsets me is a lot of people in the news, national news, local news says, well, now we're getting back to normal after the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I want to say, you effing idiot. You've said before that we're not going back to the way it was. It's a new normal and it's
Right.
yet to be defined. And I think that one of the things that's coming out now that in this country, we're coming out of the pandemic, although, I'm really concerned, particularly in those communities and areas where the vaccination rate is not as high as it should be, that the Delta variant is going to cause a resurgence in this country.
Right.
I mean, you're seeing that in Russia right now. You're seeing it in Southeast China.
Oh yeah.
Uh, but I think what's happened by people having the ability to work at home, work remotely, and have more control of their lives rather than having to report into an office and so forth. Um, it was the CEO of Goldman Sachs basically said the other day, we want everybody back in the office by September. And if you're not, we'll have to have a conversation about that. I think we talked about this in the last episode,
Mm-hmm.
and that a lot of people are going to say, well, fine, if Goldman Sachs, if you're going to run it that way, screw you. I'll quit and go work for Citibank because Citibank's not taking the same kind of attitude. And I think
Right.
that there is a certain, humanization that is coming out of this where, you know, workers, because of the way the dynamics of the labor force have been disrupted, truly disrupted by the pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
workers are in more control of jobs and the workplace than the employers are. And I think that what that indicates that the relationship between the employer and the employee has been, I'm going to milk them for everything I can get.
Well, I think it's so important that you bring that up because one of the things that was brought up in legal eagle clip, the legal eagle clip was the question of is data chattel? Is data an actual tool versus an actual being? And I think that this gets into a larger conversation that we can apply here in the real world situation we're dealing with, where for the longest time, a lot of these CEOs and a lot, and I want to stop for a second. And Dad, feel free to push back if you don't agree with me saying this, but we keep saying CEO and the CEOs and these billionaires, but we have to remember that these CEOs and billionaires are reporting to boards, and that these boards are made up of shareholders who ultimately have a lot more power than the CEO themselves in many cases. So it's not these individual billionaires that are only to blame. There's large organizations all over the world that are making these decisions that human beings are essentially tools or chattel to help them gain profit. But we have to remember that, like, it's a larger organization than just Bruce Maddox. It's Starfleet that wants disassembled data, too. It's more than just Jeff Bezos who wants his employees pissing in
I mean,
Gatorade bottles. It's the shareholders at Amazon that want that, too.
there was a shift, I think, back in the '70s where there was some concern. Well, there was less. CEO compensation was much higher than it was for the regular, employee and so forth. But since the '70s and the '80s, the compensation for CEOs for large companies, particularly large companies, has so outstripped, we're talking about hundreds of times what, the average worker in a company gets paid. And part of that, I think, is because there's much more emphasis on a CEO being in a position of I have to maximize the return on investment to the shareholders.
Right.
And, yeah, that's important. That's part of a capitalist system and so forth. But, that's where, like anything in life, things have been out of balance. And maybe what's
Hmm.
happening right now with what the disruption that the pandemic's caused. And I don't think we even totally understand it and where it's going because it's so new. But it's maybe that things are getting back into balance. There was one article I read
Right.
that the reason that um, productivity. Everybody thinks that, once we went to remote work, that productivity would fall. Turns out that some measurements, and these are like, I don't know whether it's Harvard or Wharton or what business school it was, productivity improved. And one of the reasons that companies want people to be back in the office is they don't trust them that they'll do the work.
Oh, it's a
and and
thousand
and and,
percent
and,
about control.
and remote work has demonstrated, since productivity went up, is saying that if you hire the right employees and you set the rules for how remote work is done and incentivize people to the company goals and so forth, you there's no reason to distrust these employees.
Well, I can actually speak to the kind of the corrosiveness of the office system in general when it comes to kind of this that corporate level. I worked at a large corporate law firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, which I won't name, but I worked in their corporate immigration department. And one thing that I I remember, it was the first day they actually sat me down and they assign you a computer at these companies now, and this is registered to you. But I remember one of the first emails that came out was, they were telling people at work who were using the computers that they can't watch porn on the computers while at work. But I remember getting that email. I'm like, so if people are here at work acting this way at work, why is there any belief that they're not gonna act this way at home? And I think it gets back to the point you just said about you need to hire the right people. You know, a lot of it isn't just hiring the right people, it's also about fostering trust in those right people. And I think for
Yes.
the longest time, our I think the reason why at this law firm I was at, people were watching porn during work is because there was just a general sense of mistrust and a general sense of disunity, and kind of a general sense that like people didn't matter on an individual human level next to like pushing paper and the bottom line. And when people felt that way, they started to misbehave. Like, it was a well known thing at this place I was working at that, a lot of people were dealing drugs at work. A lot of people were just taking off or doing a lot of different things. And I really do think it came down to like the pressure of always being micromanaged and always being watched, to the point where they wore themselves out so much micromanaging each other that at some point they just throw up the illusion that everyone's doing their job and no one's actually doing their job.
It's interesting, but you think about how much control there was over workers under the communist system
Right.
back in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. Their economies stank. Their
Oh,
productivity was
awful.
was,
Yeah.
was nothing because just for the reasons you just said, nobody had any incentive to. Of course, they didn't have capitalism. They got no benefit from
Well, when you put
the
people in a
system.
situation where they have no benefit and they don't see any immediate gain for them outside of what their employer's getting, they immediately fall to what I call darker impulse behaviors. Like alcoholism or drug abuse or violence at home, a lot of this stuff actually we're discovering, a lot of it starts from workplace abuse. It turns out a lot of people are going to work and feeling like they are not being treated as humans, and they're psychologically building that up and taking it home and taking it out on themselves and each other and their families. I think one thing that happened in the pandemic is that people were able to finally get away from this kind of soul sucking occupation they had to do day in and day out.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of them saw how they were around their families without this job or
Mhm.
without having the pressure of their boss barking down their neck every day.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of people decided that they were better people
Mm-hmm.
once they got out of the system that basically pushed them into being bad people for the sake of getting the job done.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's happening here. And I think, like you said, there's that moment where Data makes the comparison of Geordi's eyes, where Picard stops and goes, "Oh, we're becoming bad people because we're not even questioning what we're doing. We're just going along for it because we see a benefit. We're not even asking what the actual risk is to it."
And that changes, that just wakes Picard up so that he decides that he needs to, defend Data, that he doesn't agree with what Starfleet is doing. He doesn't agree with Maddox. And, since Judge Advocate General Captain Louvois is there, he puts himself in a situation where they have a hearing, actually have a trial. Uh, According to that.
Which,
The
you know,
other thing I wanted to bring up, which was
yeah,
important
absolutely.
to hold this, was um, Guinan
Right.
talking to, who was she having the conversation
With
with?
Picard
With
about
Picard. That's
disposable
right.
people. And
Yes.
I think that
Yes.
this I actually wanted to bring up the line because I have it right here if you don't mind. I would like to read
Go
it.
ahead. Yeah.
So, so this is right after Riker, who was basically drafted to represent Maddox as the prosecution, um, delivers a devastating case where he basically points out not only Data's physical um, functional superiority to the regular officer, but also his non-humanness by doing things like taking apart his hand, having him bend steel bars, all of which is actually pretty devastating. Is built on an emotional argument that isn't
And
actually
it actually turns him off too.
yes, which the legal eagle during their clip the lawyer in that clip brings up the idea that Data's murdered in that moment.
Mm.
I I actually
I
disagree
didn't
with
buy
that.
that. I didn't buy
Well,
that. No. Yeah.
I think the question of life and death and murder really does change for an android
Right.
when we
Yes.
start talking
Yeah.
about that. Because the difference between us and an android is that, like, if you turn me off, you can't just turn me back on. Like, you have to do some pretty strict, hard, strenuous things to get me going again. Where Data, it seems like you probably just hit a button and he's like, "Oh,
Yeah.
hi."
Exactly. Right.
Um, so I think that entire argument of like whether or not Data is murder is kind of farcical. But um, so Picard is sitting at 10 forward at the bar with Guinan because he's like, Riker basically shoved it up my ass this morning.
Right. Yes.
What do I do? And Guinan kind of guides Picard into thinking, like, you're not really looking at this argument the right way. If Data's taken, it won't just be a win for Star Trek, it'll be setting a precedent. And Picard's like, "What do you mean?" And I'm kind of paraphrasing it, but here's the actual line. Guinan says, Consider that in the history of many worlds there have always been disposable creatures. They do the dirty work. They do the work that no one else wants to do because it's too difficult or too hazardous. In an army of datas, all disposable, you don't have to think about their welfare. You don't have to think about how they feel. Whole generations of disposable people. You're talking about slavery, Picard says, aghast. I think that's a little harsh, says Guinan. I don't think that's a little harsh, Picard responds. I think that's the truth. But that's the truth we've obscured behind a comfortable, easy euphemism, property. But that's not the issue at all, is it? I, I think that line right there and that interaction between Whoopi Goldberg, who, every scene that she has in season 2 so far has just been great. Um, I think that really nails home the problem that we're dealing with here, not only in terms of Data's humanness as an android, but our larger conversation about human worth next to many of the industries and the agendas that we're coming up against. Where, Picard uses the word property as, that's the
Yeah.
easy euphemism, but I think that we could also use the word profit in terms of 2021 and applying it to that. We
Good.
pursue profit over human worth.
Just on the issue of uh, property.
Yeah,
You know, at one point earlier on before the trial, for the hearing, Data decides the way to defend himself is to resign from Starfleet.
right.
But then he gets caught up in the whole net again because the interpretation of federal law at that point is that data is the property of Starfleet. Now
Well, Starfleet rolled. Yeah,
that gets reversed, which coming out of the whole discussion with Picard has with Guinan and how she provides him with an avenue for him to come to the conclusion that this really is a form of slavery. When Louvois reverses the position and says that, well, because Picard challenges her, you're out here, far from Earth, and you can have the opportunity to actually make new law. She reverses it and says at the end of the hearing that he's not uh, property at all. And so what happens is that the whole chain of events challenges the current Federation law
yeah,
and demonstrates to me, note I made, that there's a natural evolution to laws as the world changes. And
right.
this is a very important point to now. Um, and it goes back even to 1989 because you have this, conservative legalism, from particularly from the federal courts and the Supreme Court,
Absolutely.
that you have this, well, the originalism. We need to have originalism. We need to define law in the 21st century
Based on what
based
the
upon what
founders
the
in the
founding fathers in the 18th
right.
century. And it's just it's stupid. I mean, that's not a pejorative term. It's just stupid to realize that as the world changes and we understand more and society changes, you and I've talked about this before, that rather than being 26 amendments to the Constitution, there should be 50 at least. If not, the whole damn Constitution needs to be rewritten.
Well, one thing that I think needs to be pointed out, and you pointed it out very succinctly in your notes. One of the reasons we got here, it isn't like Starfleet just decided one day, oh, we're going to disassemble Data and let Bruce Maddox have all of his dreams come true. There had to be some sort of institutionalized decision making along the chain of command that experimenting on a Starfleet officer was permissible in the first place. And I think that needs to highlight something very important, that this goes actually outside of philosophy, and this kind of goes outside of politics as well. But when you start to see abuses happen in society, it's easy to always point out at individuals like Bruce Maddox, but as I was saying earlier, we have to remember that a lot of this stuff starts out on a systemic institutional level. It's not just one person leading the charge to do bad things. It's someone not paying attention or not thinking about, you know,
Not not thinking through it. Yes, right.
Data wasn't there to ask the admiral, why don't you have your eyes replaced? He could only ask Picard. So somewhere along the chain of command, no one was there to ask those individual people making those decisions, would you have your eyes switched out for better ones? And in some ways that means one of two things. Sometimes the system isn't inherently evil. It's just the pursuit of the system is to better itself, even to the point of not being considerate of the actual human costs. I think that we always have to remember whatever human system we put into place, even democracy, and we're talking about America here. Our democracy has never been perfect, and it's always left a lot of people out. And even today, we are still working desperately to try to enfranchise and include more people in it. The only way we do that is by taking into account the strengths and flaws of the system that we build to ensure that. And I think one of the big flaws that this episode exposes is that there really isn't a thought to the individual welfare of officers in Starfleet. And I think that we see that sometimes in the decision making of CEOs and just Starfleet in general when it comes to putting their officers into greater risk. One narrative thing that I noticed in Star Trek really is that, with the exception of the president in Undiscovered Country, who is the best president in any movie I've ever seen.
Yes, right.
No, seriously, that's the guy I want talking to the Russians during our intergalactic Cuban Missile Crisis. Really, I want that guy. Um, it just seems like there's a lot of this kind of throwing everything against the wall and seeing what sticks in terms of Starfleet's decision making process sometimes.
Hmm. Hmm.
It just seems like the Starfleet itself could actually be rife for abuse if we're not uh, careful. One thing that I want to get back on, you brought it up that at one point Maddox promises Data your memories and knowledge will remain intact. But we had in the previous episode, the Schizoid Man, Ira Graves take over Data's body and basically destroy all of Data's identity and memories. So it comes to a question in terms of defining the soul and aspects of the soul. Are we our memories and our knowledge, or are we our emotions? Or are we much more than that? Like, what happens when we actually take the body away? What do we actually become in that sense? I know that's a very deep philosophical question for 1041 at night, but I was just wondering what you think of the idea of keeping someone's memories and knowledge intact, but at the same time, like, doing away with the rest of them. I know we kind of touched on this during the Schizoid Man, but
I think, first of all, I think that the whole concept of humans having a soul is is a question for special metaphysics, and one is, spiritual and religious and based on faith, because there's just no good empirical evidence that
mm-hmm,
such exist. But then it gets into the practical side of your question. Is I mean, my only thought is that um, you know people's ideas and personality, well, particularly their knowledge, um, sort of, if people remember an individual like a Beethoven or an
mm-hmm,
Einstein or a Socrates or a Aeschylus and so forth, and that in a sense makes them immortal
right,
because of what they've contributed to humankind.
mm-hmm,
And I think that every individual, I mean, there's a lot of individuals that, you know, work hard and they raise their families and so forth, and they're not remembered.
mm-hmm,
At the same time, you know, particularly if they try to make life better for their family while they're on earth, while they're alive, and they instill to their offspring to try to make the world a better place. They may not be recognized, but um, that is a um, it's something that you've contributed to the
right.
world, to humankind, to evolution as a species, as a society, as a culture, and so on.
Well, if anything, if anything, it's the most beautiful thing about us as humans because it's unique to us. Just let me go off on a tangent here to
You go
explain
ahead.
this. Lions. Okay, lions have offspring. They have cubs, but they're teaching those cubs how to work together in a pack formation, how to work together in the pride, how to initiate mating with a male, how to hunt down caribou and gazelle, and how to properly feast and delineate food. Nowhere in there are they telling their are those lionesses teaching their cubs, here's how you become a morally better lion, and here's how here's how you're going to leave the savannah better for the next generation. That's a very uniquely human thing that we're doing.
Well, it's reflected actually in what the Bible tells us is that the concept that God gave man responsibility to have stewardship over, the dominion on earth that he has given us. So by having that stewardship and responsibility, part of that is to maintain what we have, make it better. And now actually we have the challenge with climate change and population growth and so forth and pollution of not killing ourselves as a
Well,
species.
it's, I think it's in many ways our ability to, you know, our greatest biological success is our ability to procreate and keep our genes going. Our past, every organism, our basic success is our ability to keep our genes proliferating within our environment or just keep them going.
That's what every form of life does, even if you're a coronavirus.
But that's why I think it's really important that when we have humans or we have creatures that are really focused on the idea of leaving the universe a better place, it really is evolutionary. It's evolutionary in itself because it really does separate us from kind of the
Yes,
rest of nature, even though we
sure.
are still part of it.
Right,
So it
right.
puts our humanity in a very difficult position because on one hand, we like, and even data subjected to this too, even as an android, we are bound by this physical universe, which is a brutal, often scary place with more risk to us than there is benefit. Like, if we're just being scientifically honest, the universe is a very dangerous place. But I think the reason why we are able to think that we can circumnavigate it or negotiate it or maybe even surmount these challenges is because we have this evolutionary idea that we can have it better than we had it the day before, and we can keep building upon that. You know, ch- recently the big news in terms of chimpanzee and bonobo evolution is the fact that they're starting to use like hand tools.
Right.
But that took like tens of thousands of years for them to start using hand tools. We could develop an entirely new way of thinking in 100 years with the uh, adaptation of cybernetic implants in our brains that connect us to a greater network of consciousness or whatever you want to call it. You know, we as humans have the ability to jump up levels that other organisms don't on this planet. Now, in Data's case, and I think that's the argument that's being made here by Maddox, Data could actually jump up more levels than humans could faster and get us so much more ahead than where we are now if we didn't have to worry about the weaknesses or frailties of flesh and blood. One in, one instance, though, that I think why this is so dangerous is they have, I forget who's in the room. Oh, it's Louvois, it's Philippa, Picard, and Maddox, and this is when they decide that they're going to have a hearing. Um, Maddox is saying like, why are you standing in the way of my work, my achievements? Why can't I not just achieve what I want? I wanted to bring this up because one thing that was happening in the 80s, 70s, and 80s was the rise of Ayn Rand. And for those of you who don't know at home, Ayn Rand is a Russian immigrant who came over to America from the Soviet Union, and she wrote some very famous books, including Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead. Um, but she was also the founder of a philosophy called Objectivism, which is one of the big backbones of the modern day conservative movement. For example, Paul Ryan, who was a former Speaker of the House and big Republican honcho during the Bush and the George W. Bush and Obama years, once said that his two favorite books were the Bible and Atlas Shrugged. Now, if you've read the Bible and if you've read Atlas Shrugged, and you think about those two books, and you hear someone say, "These are my two favorite books," Ben and anyone listening at home, if you have any sense of human decency or a soul, you kind of have to stop and go like, okay, I get the Bible, but Atlas Shrugged, what the fuck? The entire argument of objectivism is that human individual greed is good. It is actually the thing that pushes us forward. And by focusing on our own individual quest for whether it's sex or wealth or whatever sort of power we want, we're actually doing better for the world by being selfish than we are
That
being
was that
selfless.
was the 1980s. Wall Street, Gordon Gekko.
Well, like, a lot of that came from Ayn Rand. Like, a lot of
Yes.
people don't realize that the literary power of those books really has carried over into American culture. There is a reason why, from the Young Republican movement on college campuses to the Heritage Foundation to the Cato Institute, they're all reading Ayn Rand. Really, go and look at their reading lists, and they all have reading lists. Atlas Shrugged, The Fountainhead, and a lot of her work show up because of this objectivist idea that, like, my own self interest and my own benefit outweighs everything else. And if you just let me indulge in it, I can just prove to you that it'll all be for your benefit. Basically, it's trickle down economics, but the boss at the
Right.
top is saying, I promise you, give me all the money, and like it'll work out for you."
Well, everyone out there in the audience, one of the things Jay found, there's this YouTube channel called Legal Eagle, where
Right.
this attorney, I don't know where he's from, but he's a litigator. He's got litigation experience, and he reviews different shows, particularly those that have a legal aspect to it, and just comments as to how accurate it is in
It's a
terms of.
pretty fun channel.
It is actually a fun channel. It is really, and but some of the comments, he would watch the episode and would stop here and there and make comments for Measure of a Man, and one of the things he um, that says that you know that when Maddox says, well, this is necessary because this can result from it. And, when he's ignoring the question of whether uh, Data is a sentient being and whether he has rights, he makes the comment, no, the ends do not justify the means. And
Right.
the other thing that you kind of touched on is Maddox, expresses himself that I have a right to do my research on data.
Right.
And Mr. Legal Eagle says, no, he does not have a right to do. Just because he wants to do the research doesn't mean he has to do. He has a right.
Well, like think of other figures in history who've had the supposition that their goal for perfection or whatever their quest was presupposed that like the loss or suffering of humans was justified. Now, I mentioned earlier in the show Joseph Mengele, who looked at all the victims from the concentration camps that he was working in as just like fodder for him to try to quote unquote perfect humanity, even though he was doing horrendous experimentation. Um, Likewise, like, we've, and you and I are both from North Carolina, there was a long lawsuit where they were taking black communities and euthanizing them to experiment to
Yeah.
see what the health aspects would be upon euthanizing other people because and essentially they did it to these people without permission because they were like, well, these people are black, so they don't have any worthiness. Essentially, the North Carolina treated them like chattel.
Well, and the Germans did it during World War II.
Right.
The Japanese did that experiments on Chinese prisoners and probably some Americans. And
Well,
and
if we're
and, and we're not immune from it either, based on what you just said. Because what was the Tuskegee experiments where they would give these African American guys neurosyphilis and see how they would get sick, how it would affect them when they got to the final stages of neurosyphilis,
okay, well,
which is
with
interesting
Tuskegee
because
is
experimentation, that sort of mistreatment of African Americans, is alive and well today, because that's why African Americans have a distrust of our medical system, and why
absolutely,
in many cases they don't want to take that goddamn vaccine.
which makes total sense because we've given them every impetus not to.
It's very unfortunate, but that's how it is.
Well, not only in terms of our treatment of black communities here in America, but for a present one, and we'll probably get banned on YouTube for saying this out loud, but one of the things that's going on in terms of the Uyghur concentration camps in China is that the Chinese government is actually using these Uyghurs to medically experiment on them. Like, this is something that we've been able to confirm through the media, that medical experimentation upon um, illegally detained Muslims in China is taking place. And it really comes to the question, ends don't justify the means. I think it's a, I think that there is such a, I think that we have gotten so deep in our culture, and not just Eastern culture, not just Western culture, but in modern culture, that we have put forth the idea of, um, I don't want to call it heroic, but we've kind of built this idea of like the gallant entrepreneur or the gallant inventor or the gallant great mind who pushes us forward. And I grew up with Lex Luthor, and there was this post that I put on Facebook today. Today's June 2021, folks. Um, don't go look at my Facebook, but one of them was about Superman, and the fantasy of Superman isn't how great it would be if you were able to have powers, but the fantasy is how great it would be if someone had so much power, but they still decided to be good. And I think that's important because, like, Superman's main enemy is Lex Luthor. And Lex Luthor is a wealthy capitalist who believes that his right to see his own vision through supersedes everything else, even to the point of I have a right to capture Superman and medically experiment on him to decide whether or not aliens are a threat to the planet. That's literally Lex Luthor's MO when he decides to become Superman's enemy. He's like, this guy could be an enemy. I need to capture him and kill him so I can develop weapons to stop them. I think that there's this aggrandizement, I think, in particularly modern society, that if someone has a vision and it's bold and powerful, we're not supposed to get in the way of it. But the
Well,
truth is, if you don't get in the way of it, terrible things can happen. For every Maddox, I think of an Oppenheimer, Dad. Oppenheimer really did work on that bomb, and he probably had an idea of what it could do. But until he actually saw it explode, he didn't realize the potential of what he had unleashed. And
once he quoted the Vedas, yes,
yeah,
right,
I am I've become the destroyer of worlds.
right.
He didn't say that in triumph. He said that
No,
in this kind of like, oh no, what have I done?
exactly.
And I think that none of us have learned Oppenheimer's lesson in our modern society when it comes to really taking into account the effects and impacts we have with our progress. Like, for example, we're doing this tonight on Zoom, but one thing I'm going to use to promote this show is social media. We don't really know the impact of social media is having on us in terms of our mental health or our general physical wellness, or how it's changing our children in terms of the progress of our society. It's a piece of technology that probably started off as a good idea, but no one took into account the real impacts of what it was going to do. Just like in A Measure of a Man, no one at Starfleet, and especially not Maddox, is taking into account, for all the positive impacts of having 1,000 datas. We don't look at the real human cost. Just like I was making mention earlier, like, once you take away humans from war and put in AI, you're losing
Well,
something very important
it,
that
it
stops atrocities from happening.
I think what it is it gets into the process of history and how you define history. Is that when you develop something new, it's very difficult, if not impossible, even in some cases, to identify all the potential unintended consequences.
Hmm.
But if you can, you know, stop while you're in the process, like I think that's what's happening with social media now. It's 20 years old, something like that, and we're stopping and say, wait a minute, what is this doing to us? What rules do we have to create? Can we put the genie back in the bottle even?
I wonder if that is a natural occurrence in technology, though. Like,
I
part of
think it
it,
probably is.
well, I think part of it is us being cognizant that social media is changing us. I think part of it, too, is us reaching the edge of what a technology can do, because we've had social media for about 20 years now.
Right.
Um, what is really the next step in terms of this medium as a tool for communication or better knowledge? That's not really clear because it seems like we've
No.
reached the maximum capacity of what this can
Right.
do. One thing that I think is really important to ask, and something that Maddox doesn't bring up, is what's the maximum capacity of data? Because there's this idea somehow that if you have 1,000 datas and let's say you need to fund an army to go and fight a war, what's the guarantee that these datas actually, these armies of datas actually beat people that have the creative ability that these androids don't have? There's also it seems like there's a jump to this assumption that if you just start replicating data, things are going to get better, but there's no guarantee of that. And I think human history actually speaks. Hell, even Star Trek history speaks to that in terms of like the augments.
Well,
Um,
I had a question about that when during the early part of the trial, the hearing, and Riker asked Data what his computing capacity was, and he threw out the numbers and so forth. It's like, okay, but how does that compare with what human capability is?
right.
And it was like, okay, that's fine, but to me, that wasn't one of the strong points of Riker's presentation as far as I was concerned.
Honestly, one thing that I took away from the Legal Eagle clip that I thought was really good. Riker doesn't actually make an argument. Like, he doesn't use data to convince the audience or the judge that, like,
Yes.
Data's actually not a machine and not doesn't possess humanity. He just shows a bunch of things that Data can do to prove that he's not human. That I think Picard does a very good job of actually defeating during the scene, even though he's objective. He some of his objections are overruled and he just gives
Right.
up at some point. Like the one where Data has to bend the steel bar, like okay, certain humans can bend steel
Sure.
bars. Like,
Yeah.
why don't you require that all humans bend steel bars at a minimum then in Starfleet?
Right.
Um, one thing though that I think Riker does point out that it is a good argument for Maddox's position is that um, Data really does have, and I really want to make sure I get uh this part. Uh, when Riker does the Pinocchio is broken, its strings have been cut. I think there's actually a really good argument there for first why Riker is wrong about this because first of all, Data's not a puppet. Like there's not anyone exclusively controlling Data.
It's a
The
good point.
entire argument is built off of this idea that once we turn Data off, we're no like Data's no longer in control and we're no longer in control of him. But Data hasn't been in. No one's been in control of Data from the get go. Like his entire career has basically been at Data's will to begin with.
Well, and that gets into a point I wanted to bring up is that at the end of the hearing, uh, the judge says that declares that as a result of the arguments put forth, that Data has the freedom to choose.
Right.
And he then says that, I choose not to be part of this experiment, but I'm intrigued by it. So, and Data had said, I don't think your premises for doing your study experiments on me are really well thought out. So, think about it more. Maybe I'll work with you. He's open to exploring things. But the thing I wanted to bring up, since this was in 1989 and the whole abortion issue was, ongoing then,
Right.
when it says Data has the freedom to choose, I, thought, well, how does this, is this making any statement? Was there intent to make any statement? Perhaps not, but in terms of the whole abortion issue of a woman having the right to choose what happens to her body.
I think there's a general statement being made by Star Trek that even though they live in a future where things like racism, sexism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, all these things have been defeated, there is still a worry that individual sovereignty and individual justice could be superseded. And I think not only when it comes to a woman's right to decide what is done with her own body, but also a person's right to decide what sort of substances they put in their own body, or what sort of things that they eat, or what gods they pray to, or what gods they decide not to pray to, or even if they deign to believe that there are gods. Um, I think that there is a larger issue at hand where, and I think the writers of Star Trek notice this. Our society, even to today, from 1989, has had real potentials to turn authoritarian when we haven't been careful. And I think I think Louvois is stating something that is kind of held to be I'm sorry, held to be sacred in the 24th century by Starfleet. You can't have a working system unless people have individual liberties and rights. And once you take those away, it doesn't matter how strong your outer society is, the inner society that people feel on the inside, that we all feel like we're a part. For example, and I know some people are going to hear this and they're going to be like, well, that wasn't my experience, Jay. And for a lot of people, it wasn't their experience. But and we talked about this a few episodes. The thing that makes a nation work sometimes is that we all have to believe in a communal myth that we're all endowed. In America, the great communal myth for a long time is that we're all endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights and the ability to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Like, those are part of our American story. They're supposed to define who we are as citizens. But in actuality, in actual practice, it's much harder than that. It seems, though, in the future, however, in the 24th century, Starfleet really does go out of their way to ascertain people's individual liberty in a really effective societal way, to where it's not only playing out for the individual in their home, it actually plays out in greater societal impacts. If everyone actually feels like they have the ability to live their lives with a certain amount of autonomy and freedom, even though they're in this system that kind of provides them everything, and I should mention, is monitoring them at all times, because you know, one piece of technology I don't think we ever take into account when we discuss these episodes. The Enterprise can use its sensors and tell you how many people are in a specific area, in a specific square foot, at any given time, like down to the person, and they can tell you what their genetic makeup is from space with these
Mm-hmm.
sensors. The
Mm-hmm.
idea that Starfleet isn't monitoring everyone every goddamn minute of every goddamn day. And think about this for a second, just from a health perspective. If you had the ability to monitor everyone in your society, and let's say Jake Reckward suddenly had a heart attack, and he was hooked up to a government monitoring system, and the monitoring system went, oh no, Jake's having a heart attack, and it immediately enlisted EMS to come to wherever he was. Is that a bad thing?
Mm-hmm.
Arguably that's not a bad thing. That means that we've developed a system that can actually help its citizens in dire times of crisis, and so, and like a medical event. But on the other hand, like, I know exactly when Jake's Record's heart's beating. I know exactly what he's doing. I know if he's running. I know if he's sleeping. I know exactly what he's doing on a biological level.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting to some very difficult things philosophically in terms of people's individual sovereignty and rights. But it seems still, despite all of these technological things that you could use to take away people's sovereignty, it seems like Starfleet tries to rule at least on the idea of individual liberty and freedom,
They have the potential for being Big Brother, but they choose not to be Big Brother.
which I think gets into a greater philosophical discussion that you and I have had many times. Real power isn't in the accumulation of it, it's actually giving away power for others to discover themselves.
Yep.
That's nodding at that.
No, no. Because at times I go back to trying to better understand uh, my Christian background, the Christian faith I have left. I think that's what Jesus does for
Well,
people.
I think, one part of continuing to evolve is that you have to give individual creatures the ability to make the decision to evolve on their own. You can't force. Well, and we can.
That was my last note. Was everyone from this episode was everyone needs to continue to evolve.
Right. Um, and one thing, and I'll make an example of this to end in terms of being able to evolve. One last note. So during the courtroom scene, Picard uses a lot of Data's keepsakes to show Data's humanity. And I think that this is an example where we see Data actually evolve into something where that Data's been in the process of evolving on his own as an individual. You
Yes.
know, Picard takes out things like he takes out a book, he takes out Data's medals, which I think it's very interesting that like Starfleet is willing to experiment on its own officers, even though he's practically a hero in their book.
Yeah. Right.
Um, oh, okay, here before I go into Picard, here's a quick question, Starfleet: why even give an android medals if he's property? Like, why even reward him and build that system of worth if you didn't think he was deserving of it in the first place? That's makes no sense.
I think
Anyway,
that's I think that's some of the paradoxes in this that
right.
it kind of helps make the story from the writer's standpoint.
But one thing that Picard takes out is a holocube that has a portrait of slain Enterprise crew member Tasha Yar. And Picard asks Data, "What purpose do any of these things serve you?" And then he asks a question about the uh, holocube, pointing out that Data has no other portraits of his fellow crewmates. Data replies that he would prefer not to answer any questions related to Yar, as he had given his word to her not to speak of the matter. But Picard gently goads him into revealing that Data and Yar had actually been intimate. And it's actually a moment where Captain Louvois actually stops and goes like, "Wait a second, you were intimate?" And I actually think that that may have been really the kind of moment where she decided that he had some sort of free will.
Right. Yeah, that's
Because
a good point. Uh-huh.
I think it's in our capacity to love, ultimately, that makes us human. And I
Uh-huh.
think the one thing that keeps being highlighted in Picard's one of the things that's highlighted in Picard's argument that will end here on is that Data has medals for valor, which means he's been willing to risk himself for others. Data has a book of Shakespeare that Picard gave him because he values his friendship with Picard. He has a hollow portrait of Tasha Yar, his only lover, and maybe arguably his only love. By all accounts, like the most human thing about Data is his capacity to love and value others. And I think the moment when Louvois sees that he valued someone so deeply like Tasha Yar that he was not only intimate with her, but would keep the secret of their intimacy, I think that that is the moment when she recognizes that she's not dealing with a machine or she's not dealing
Right.
with a tool.
Yeah.
She's dealing with a thinking, caring individual who values other individuals, and in turn, because she clearly has the hots for Picard, sees that Picard values this individual back. And I think that is the real beauty of this episode. It's finding
Right.
the humanness
Yes.
and our ability to humanize each other.
Yes, absolutely.
Before we go, Dad, where do you rank this episode in terms of season two, and where do you rank this episode in general? I think it's
I
a great episode. It really is, I think, one of the better episodes of this season so
I I
far.
I, I think so. Yeah, I think it's
Yeah.
very very good. Yeah.
Um, on that note, we'll call it a night. Thank you,
Okay.
everyone, for joining us. We will be back next time for Star Trek Season 2, Episode 10. Not one of my favorites, but we'll talk about it anyway. The Dauphine, a Wesley episode.
Yes.
So, Dad, I'll see you later.
All right. Bye, Jay.
Bye.